In early February 1958, a drama played out in a house called Ben Adair on the Bullscudden Road in Howth, a small village outside of Dublin in Ireland. In the house lived a man calling himself Dr. Karl Kuan, who had written a book called The Third Eye under a pen name Tuesday Lobsang Rampa. For convenience, I'll refer to him as Rampa throughout this video. The book, an international bestseller, is meant to have earned the equivalent of £1 million in royalties by this time. I should say that The Third Eye was apparently the autobiography of a Tibetan Lama. Now, Rampa got on well with his neighbours in Howth, and if he and his wife were a little eccentric, well, they were foreign. They were friendly, and they were also very generous. Rampa was meant to be writing the sequel to The Third Eye, which had the working title A Medical Lama. Living with them was a pretty young Englishwoman called Sheila Rouse, who was Rampa's secretary. Everything seemed fine. Now, I know that when the Irish photographer Pat Maxwell visited the Rampa household in late January 1958, he came under somewhat false pretenses. The Rampas were wary of him, but he said that he was a freelance photographer, which was correct, and that the photographs that he wanted to take would be useful for general publicity purposes. When he got back to his offices that evening, Maxwell was sending those photographs off to the Daily Mail. And while he'd been out taking photos at Ben Adair, he had missed a request from Time magazine in America to take some photographs for them as well. So Maxwell went back to the Rampas and said how the first photos hadn't come out properly, and he was allowed to take a few more. Now, the Rampas may well have been suspicious. The journalist Hugh Medlicott must have visited them and had asked if Rampa's real name wasn't, in fact, Cyril Henry Hoskin. Apparently, they denied this at first, but Medlicott must have presented them with evidence, which they then must have accepted because they admitted that Rampa had essentially ghostwritten the book to hide the identity of a real Dr. Kuan, who wrote the book and lived in fear of communism. Now, elsewhere, Medlicott quotes Mrs. Rampa as having told him that The Third Eye was a work of fiction, that her husband had tried to get her a number of jobs without success, and so was persuaded to write the book for money. The Rampas would later claim that the various quotes attributed to them were made up, and I'm not sure who one should believe because the tabloids have never really been known for honesty or integrity. But the Rampas do seem to have been flailing around, trying to find a plausible explanation as to who was the author Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, who claimed to be a Tibetan Lama and whose book revealed such astounding secrets of inner Tibet. Mrs. Rouse, the secretary, is meant to have said, "We were prepared for snoopers to come and cry out the facts. I have seen the real Dr. Kuan, but I will not tell you where he is." Now, as I say, the Rampas must have been suspicious about what might be about to be written about them in the newspapers, because Medlicott had been conducting a number of interviews with friends and family of the Rampas, albeit that was back in England, and word may have well got back to them. Anyway, on the morning of the 1st of February, 1958, there was a huge expose of Rampa in the Daily Mail. Strangely, Sheila Rouse's picture took up more space than did Rampa's, in a blatant effort to suggest something sexually untoward, although this was never claimed directly. It was revealed that Tuesday Lobsang Rampa was not a Tibetan Lama at all. He wasn't even somebody called Dr. Kuan, the name he had been using until then, or Kuan So, another adopted name. He was actually, as Medlicott had suggested, a man called Cyril Henry Hoskin, the previously unemployed son of a plumber from Plympton in Devon. The Third Eye had been such an international bestseller that the world's press turned up in Howth, outside the Rampa's house, Ben Adair, demanding interviews and photographs. The writer, Eric Newby, was sent as an emissary for Rampa's publisher, Frederick Warburg. And Newby remembers journalists with mirrors on sticks trying to see into the upstairs windows, and the journalists going through the Rampa's rubbish bins. By now, the Rampas were really very wary of talking to anybody, and with good reason, and Newby himself had problems gaining entry. Newby wrote, "The Lama," his wife said, "was dying, and it was unlikely that he would live for more than a couple of days." Now, whenever Rampa was asked awkward questions, he often contracted incurable health problems, was on the very edge of death, or at the very least he was out of the country, when he patently wasn't. He was undoubtedly quite an unwell man for much of his life, but he would go on to live until he was 70. By the time Eric Newby got back the next day to Benader, Rampa had come up with an explanation that he had hitherto not thought to share with anybody in the previous few years, when it might well have come up in discussion with his agent, his editor, publishers. Through a process called transmigration, he claims that the Tibetan medical Lama, Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, had taken over the body of Cyril Henry Hoskin from Plympton in Devon. Rampa had thus written the book that he had put the name to. Hoskin was just a vehicle, and it will be convenient to forget about Dr. Karl Kuan and Kuan So. There was quite a lot of extraneous detail in Rampa's initial explanation, stuff about owls and falling out of trees, and this was tidied up and streamlined in later accounts. And no, none of this fits in with earlier suggestions that the book was fiction, or had been written for money, or had been written for somebody else called Dr. Kuan, or why he had been calling himself other names, or why he seems to have claimed academic and medical distinctions, Rampa's presumably, before the transmigration in June 1949. It doesn't explain why Rampa made so many mistakes about everyday life in Tibet when writing The Third Eye, mistakes which were tidied up pre-publication, although many more remained in the text. And being a medical Lama in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition doesn't explain why so many of his spiritual and mystical beliefs and claims that he would make over a series of another 18 books, appear to owe nothing at all to Tibetan Buddhism, or Buddhism generally, and everything to the writings of Madame Blavatsky's very dubious Theosophical Society. Of course, anyone with sufficient interest could ask the authorities in Tibet about the Lama who had transmigrated, but on at least 4 occasions that I found out, the Dalai Lama was asked about Rampa, and he declared Rampa to be a fraud. But for the next 22 years of his life, Tuesday Lobsang Rampa does not ever seem to have come out of character. He refused to enter into proper discussion about his past, preferring to address criticism only through his books, in which he simply claims that everything he said was true. He would go on to live a peripatetic life in Canada, accompanied until his death by his wife and by Sheila Rouse. Unfortunately, the two women don't seem to have liked each other over much. Rampa maintained correspondence with people, but he broke off with the only friends that he has on record, Alan Stanke, because Stanke refused to make a public statement saying that he believed Rampa's story of transmigration. Having been unable to do that for a friend, he was no longer a friend. There are people today who still believe in Rampa, who read his books and get a lot from them. Whether he's talking or claiming to talk about Buddhism, which is quite rare, or the hollow earth, the hollow moon, life on Venus, or many other pseudo-scientific crank beliefs that defy the laws of physics, the laws of probability, or simple common sense. Some of his readers and his followers today presumably do not know his background. Others, presumably, delight in knowing secrets and wonders denied to the rest of humanity.